Hi, everyone. So we had a really thought-provoking moment this morning's panel, and we're going to continue having these moments throughout. I want to welcome Professor Charles Lee right now to give our luncheon keynote, followed by a short Q&A session. Professor Lee is visiting at the Howard University School of Law this semester. Let's all welcome Professor Lee.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to start by thanking Professors Seacott, Glicksman, and Bronin for inviting me here to speak today, and also Claudia Delgado for all the support she's given to support my being here. Looking over the symposium agenda, I was really struck by how many longtime colleagues and friends are speaking here today. And I think being part of a group of mission-driven people who are committed to creating a fairer and more environmentally sustainable world is truly an honor and a blessing. It is now more important than ever for us to strengthen that community, to speak out individually and collectively, to promote resilience and positivity and hope, and to elevate our intellectual capacity through, among other things like this conference, to collectively address already critical challenges now being made even more dire by the current administration's illegal, malicious, and shameful betrayal of its environmental protection and other responsibilities. As you know, I left EPA last March, and one of the things that I resolved to do was to work on a book that many people have been urging me to do. I began seriously to think about, to write on the lessons learned from my contributions to the birth of environmental justice and the development of this theory and practice. As part of that project, I have been working during the past few months on a chapter around my landmark 1987 Toxic Waste and Race report and its role as an environmental justice game changer. As many of you know, toxic waste and race is part of the origin story of environmental justice in the United States. It grew out of my participation in a 1982 protest in Warren County, North Carolina, against the siting of a PCB hazardous waste landfill in a predominantly poor Black community where a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience resulted in over 500 arrests. When I went to work for the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice on a project on environmental hazards in people of color and low-income communities, the issue did not have a name. During my research on the issue, I quickly came to realize how enormous, pervasive, and deep-rooted the problems of race, class, and environmental equality was. This included everything from the location of hazardous waste disposal facilities, pesticides and farm workers, uranium mining on Native American lands, and to perhaps not very well known, but perhaps the worst occupational disaster in American history near Gauley Bridge in West Virginia, where more than 700 workers, mostly African American, died from acute silicosis in the 1930s and were buried in unmarked graves. I felt really compelled to find a way to bring this issue to national attention. The U.S. General Accounting Office, now the U.S. Governmental Accountability Office, did a small study of 4 off-site hazardous waste landfills in the 8 southeastern states, which comprise EPA's Region 4, after the Warren County protests. And I hit on the idea that perhaps that replicating that GAO study on a national scale would be able to put the issue on the map, both literally and figuratively. So that's what resulted in the now landmark 1987 study, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, perhaps the most influential study in the history of environmental justice. So it was relatively easy, especially with the hindsight of some 40 years, to distill what were the things that made toxic waste and race a game changer. And as the slide shows, it brought to bear empirical evidence for the first time to help define a movement. It used mapping to visualize the distribution of environmental impacts. It validated emerging community struggles on environmental issues and gave them a lens for unifying around a systemic problem. It spawned an entirely new area of scholarly research, and it spurred a significant government action. At the point when I started to work on the study, the reality that environmental burdens were disproportionately distributed was literally invisible to American society. Scholarship on social movements point out the importance of having a conceptual and rhetorical frames that help people interpret and make sense of the world around them and move them towards collective action. This often requires a redefinition of what constitutes the common sense embodied in the everyday practices of society. Today, the self-evident truth of the importance of the inequitable distribution of environmental impacts permeates throughout virtually every sphere of life, as evidenced by the fact that there are community-based environmental justice organizations in every part of the country, hundreds of university courses on the subject, and thousands of peer-reviewed publications in all areas related to public health, climate change, transportation, housing, green space and recreation, food insecurity, and literally everything in which the environment is a factor. Toxic Waste and Race was written in the tradition of physician John Snow's iconic use of maps and spatial analysis to reveal a link between the contaminated Broad Street water pump and London's 1854 cholera epidemic, and gave birth to the field of epidemiology. It was also written in the tradition of African-American journalist and civil rights activist Ida B. Wells. Her use of maps during the 1890s to show that lynchings that were taking place of African Americans were part of a systemic problem. I am exceedingly proud that Toxic Waste and Race occupies a spot in this august history. It revealed a major blind spot in environmental activism, research, and policy. It paved the way for an entire generation of activists and scholars to produce a voluminous body of work documenting how the place where one lives, works, plays, and learns matters. Using data and maps to visualize the problem of disproportionate environmental impacts made it discernible and played an integral role in ripping off the veil of imperceptibility that had rendered the problem invisible. So I approached the writing of this chapter with the question of what makes for a game, um, what makes for a game changer. I felt compelled to go beyond the things that made it a game changer in the 1980s, as important as that may be, to wrestling with the question of what is needed for an EJ game changer for these times. Professor Seacott gave a brilliant um, talk about, what the dimensions of the challenges we confront, where, there are attacks on science, erasure of facts, when there's the conversation is polarized and politicized, and where there's devastating attacks on basic democratic institutions, and we need to say it out loud, the clear and present crisis of fascism. So in thinking about this question, I started with a number of premises, or the premise that context matters. First, I think we should note that the that that small groups can make a big difference. The fact that toxic waste and race was done by a small advocacy organization, not a well-resourced government agency or university, is especially relevant for these times and an enduring lesson for all social justice movements that inevitably will go through ups and downs. Second, um, we have so much to work with than in the 1980s in terms of technical capacity, policy expertise, and social networks. You should know that um, when we did the toxic waste and race report, the maps that have become so impactful were drawn by hand. And today we have GIS systems that can, manipulate multiple levels of data in a matter of seconds. Um, Third, there is no silver bullet, and anything that is truly transformational results from building on and strategically leveraging little things. And it wasn't, toxic waste and race was actually one of a larger series of events that has caused this kind of shift in the way that, in the emergence of environmental justice in the United States. And fourth, I think it's important to think about this question as a generational question. Um, it is not that things that happen in next year or the next several years is not important. They're very important, but this is not a question that's going to be solved in a year or two. It is something that it requires truly a transformational and structural change, and that is never easy. So there are five things about creating a game changer for these times I have been thinking about. So the first is, of course, that we need to cultivate a. I'm sorry about the slides. We need to cultivate a new generations of leaders. And I want to point out, and I keep making this point, that environmental justice is rooted in communities, and there continues to be a vibrant movement. It has never been, and it is not now, predicated on the existence or non-existence of a government program or policy. Um, However, we need to really think about how to nurture the, 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 the many young people who now see, who have been drawn to environmental justice and see it as an important part of their life's work, and will be. And that means many of you here, and will be our future leaders. Second, we need to build on, we need to build on evidence of broad public support for issues related to environmental justice. Recent polling work done by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications and the We Act for Environmental Justice and other environmental justice organizations found high levels of support around issues related to environmental justice. So this means that we should not back down from using the concept, but work to communicate it better in ways that are empathetic and connects with the lived realities of overburdened communities. And this is a little bit more complicated than this. So on the one hand, what the polling says is that there's support for these issues. On the other hand, the concept of climate justice, the concept of environmental justice is not well understood. And so that means that our work needs to be focused on how to explain it better in ways that connect with communities and the larger public. 3, we need to develop models for scaling up. I think the last panel just gave so many examples of that, but I want to just point out that it is really important to work on issues like, in my case, I've been focusing on cumulative impacts. An example of this, the importance of this, is that during the first Trump administration, I focused a lot on environmental justice policies at the state level, because that's where the cutting edge work was. And so that focused on, things like California is use of the Cal EnviroScreen mapping tool and the allocation of resources to the most disadvantaged and overburdened, underserved communities. And this got replicated in several states like New York and Illinois, and that led to a truly important initiative during the Biden administration called Justice 40, which stipulated that 40% of a class of federal programs needs to benefit the most overburdened and underserved communities. Another way of posing that question is, if would there even have been a Justice 40 if these programs, these efforts at the state, local level were not, developed? So, fourth, I think we need to think about, and this is from the perspective of my talking to environmental justice groups and environmental justice advocates. We need to think about moving from advocacy to governance. That EJ advocates, people like yourself, needs to get involved in the political process, including running for electoral office, as hard as that may be. And one of the reasons I think that's important, it goes back to the need to better explain these concepts. And you can't do that unless you actually go out and try to do it. However, we should also look at places like California, where advocates have developed a framework called the Governing Power Framework. And we can go into more detail about that. And there's a larger historical context to this as well. But in California, there's been this remarkable string of environmental justice laws and policies. We can get into that in the discussion period. So lastly, we need to think about, and there is a conversation emerging in different circles around reimagining the future. So what I have thought about in terms of what that conversation should include is, how do we make consideration of the distribution of environmental burdens and benefits a core value and principle for government decision making? Two, how do we build out a conceptual framework for the multiple types of cumulative impact policy and analysis tools that's needed for different decision contexts? Three, how do we adapt and expand the approach developed by the now eliminated EPA Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights to create not just a grant program, but a whole ecosystem of support for communities that fundamentally changes their relationship to government, academia, and industry? Four, how do we unify the fields of public health and environmental protection and make that the heart of a whole government approach? And then lastly, in the words of environmental justice icon Dr. Beverly Wright, who works in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, how do we reimagine basic environmental laws like the Clean Air Act? So all this has led me to come up with the core argument for my book as part of a conversation about how to build forward better together. And so I said this when I received, last year I received a We Act for Environmental Justice's Environmental Justice Legacy Award. So this is what I said, and you know, it is on, speaks to the core argument of this book. So throughout my 50-year quest to transform environmental justice from an issue which did not have a name to now is occupying a significant place on the center stage of the American experience, there has been one abiding theme that has become clearer and clearer over the years and is now, in my humble opinion, more profound than ever. It is the idea that environmental justice is an increasingly powerful lens for understanding and solving many of the world's most pressing problems. So with that, I want to thank you for listening.
Perfect. We welcome questions. We have about 10 minutes.
So I just want to say thank you very much. And so I'm ashamed that my panel will follow this because I was not a trailblazer, but I wanted to acknowledge that because of the work that you and so many have done, that I'm able to teach a course in environmental justice. So I would love if you might be able to speak to us a bit about what that early period was like and sort of how you all navigated making environmental justice a part of the national discourse, because I imagine that some people might be feeling like this is a period of sort of retrenchment or sort of going backwards. So if you might just shed some light on how you all navigated that initial sort of step into the national stage and how that might be something that students and others in the room think about their approach today.
You know, so that's a big question, right? So a few things. One is that, you know, the point I had made about small groups can make a big difference, and how that report in 1987 was done by a small advocacy organization, not a big, you know, government or agency or university. So, and for, I would say, 20 years, the environmental justice was was the purview of a very small group of people. And it wasn't until Katrina and really the Flint water crisis that the issue of environmental justice got onto the you know, the mainstream of American consciousness. So, you know, so I think it's important to recognize that, you know what I say to people, if you didn't expect that there would be this kind of pushback, then, you know, we all need to adjust our lenses a little bit, right? Because we're talking about stuff that's truly transformative, and there is going to be pushback. And, you know, the history of the civil rights movement, of any other social justice movement, points that out. Secondly, I think that we all believe that, and one of the core principles of environmental justice is that it's got to be rooted in communities. And so, and that uh, we've seen over the years just incredible amounts of ingenuity, innovation, and real victories. Like for example, in 1992, 1 year after the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, they in East Austin, Texas, they achieved the removal of a tank farm, and started to work on talking about zoning. So that's just one of just so many examples that we can. So I think this kind of grassroots-based approach is really is a key to is success now and success in the future. And I do say that for any students that are, or anybody who's interested in, in contributing, is to connect up with environmental justice organizations and work with them. This is important, not for them, not just for them, but also for you, I think. Because, this is where I think a lot of people will get, the kind of the reinforcement, the kind of validation, the kind of energy, the kind of positivity that we all need now. So I think, so that's two things. I think that another is, when I said before about how things are so different between now and then, right? We need to think about, what we have that we can work with, and I really wanted to, I really want to at some point look into this. Do you know that people like Brenda Mallory, who became the CEQ chair during the Biden administration, Michael Regan, Deb Haaland, and so many other people that were in the leadership in the Biden administration, all grew up being influenced by efforts around environmental justice. And so I think that as we start to think about, and I talked about like thinking about environmental justice, not just around advocacy, but also governance. As we think about this, I think that many of you who are going to go on to do much bigger and better things than we ever did, right, are going to have to think about being able to take advantage of that as you move into positions where you can really make big decisions, and I don't think that anybody should cut themselves short as to that not being possible, so I think, so those are three things. There's a lot of other things that that we could talk about, and we'd love to, whenever you have a chance.
Yeah, thank you again so much for your talk, and is it Professor Stokes for the work you all are doing. Based on your comment about needing to bridge kind of the law and public health to have more collaborative action on environmental justice, what would your suggestions be for either a law school or an undergrad or grad curriculum that would help advance current and future advocacy and organizing to further these justice issues? Because currently, community organizing is not often a part of any curriculum that I've been a part of, and yet it's such a critical skill in advancing these issues. So, but not, I mean, I don't want to lead with an
So one example of that, and this is the one issue that those of you, my colleagues at EPA, know that during the last years, I was focused on this issue of cumulative impacts, and I trying to continue to trying to further that kind of work, and so this is something where there's a lot of real interesting and impactful developments at the state and local level. For example, there was that bill in New Jersey that was a result of 2 decades of community activism, that call for a mandatory denial of permits if, the community was overburdened and, some facility would add to that. There's, let's see, there's 19 states that have legislation passed, regulations written, or bills pending around this issue of cumulative impacts. There's, see, 2 of those, New Jersey and Massachusetts, have already promulgated and are implementing regulations. 3 states, Connecticut, New York, and Minnesota, are developing regulations. And then, another example of this would be Chicago. There's an effort to pass an ordinance on cumulative impacts named the Hazel M. Johnson Cumulative Impacts Law. And Hazel Johnson has her own history in this. She's sometimes called the grandmother of environmental justice. She worked in the housing project Oakdale Gardens. She started the first environmental organization in a Black housing project. Oakdale Gardens is where Barack Obama did his work as a youth, as a community organizer. So all these are examples of how community efforts are part and parcel, an integral part of policymaking. And I think that, when we start to think about this and connect up the kind of issues that you guys are all dealing with, and add that component to it, you begin to integrate this important perspective or lens to whatever you're dealing with.
So we're at the hour, so I want us to